Call this House to order. Before we begin this quarterfinals, let's just recognize the teams that made it this far. In opening government, we have UTMARA 1. In closing government, we have NTU 3. In opening opposition, we have SMU 2. In joining them in opposition is Chula 1. Joining me judging today's quarterfinals are Rahul, Ashay, Mabruk, and Skanda. Correct. I take your chair and join me in today's debate on the motion: this House believes that states should punish more harshly acts of terrorism committed by their own citizens than those committed by citizens of other states. Mouthful. I call upon the Honourable Prime Minister to open today's debate.
Testing. Mr. Speaker, the London bombers who bombed the tube in the UK were of local origin. They were London nationals and they were terrorists in that sense. We believe that the New York bomber who tried to bomb the Times Square using a car was also homegrown. He was not foreign, but nevertheless, he tried to commit acts of terror within America. We feel that under status quo there's a problem. There's a problem because acts of terrorism there's a propensity, an increasing and growing number of acts of terror which are committed by our own citizenry. We feel that there's a need to remedy and stamp out acts of terror committed amongst our citizens within our national boundaries, Mr. Speaker. Because acts of terror which are committed in America or say other Western liberal democracies are tried in America nevertheless. We feel, Mr. Speaker, that there needs to be a distinction between acts of terror committed by Americans or those from Western liberal democracies and between those from other states. And this is the bone of contention of and why we believe that a higher form of punishment should be reserved for those for homegrown terrorists instead of those of foreign origin. Mr. Speaker, this is a debate about we're going to be talking about three things. First, we're going to talk about how this harsher punishment works and the deterrent effect that it creates amongst the American citizenry, and especially those who have propensity or tendency to become terrorists. Secondly, we're going to talk about terrorists from our citizenry poses a higher threat from those of other nationalities. And thirdly, we're going to talk about how local terrorists breaches that loyalty and trust that the state confers to them and hence warrants a higher form of punishment. Mr. Speaker, we believe that acts of terror are those which are maliciously targeted with bad intentions upon civilians, not members of the army, but civilians who are innocent and had nothing to do with war efforts or whatever frustration that terrorists have. We believe that reservations should be of high punishment should be given for homegrown terrorists because of a multitude of reasons. Mr. Speaker, here's a contextual consideration. Firstly, terrorists from other nationalities are those who are susceptible to tighter regulations, such as visa applications, to vet out these people, and they are easily detected because these are the ones who are vetted out at immigration, and these are who have to consistently reapply and be reassessed by American government. And secondly, we believe that citizens are those who have a tendency to be recruited by other insidious elements. So we believe that we need to stamp out this form of recruitment from them. Yep, closing.
Are you saying that you are actually punishing the lack of ability for the government to investigate into those people's profile, other people of your own citizens?
But that's the problem, Mrs. Speaker. Citizens have the right to vote, right? And they vote for governments, and they don't want that amount of intrusion by the American state within their lives and within their privacy. And that's why it's hard for us to go in and breach their privacy in the name of security, Mr. Speaker. That's why our measure is more reactive in nature, because it doesn't breach their rights to privacy, but it punishes those and sends a deterrent effect to those who has a propensity to become terrorists. Firstly, the idea of a harsher punishment. We believe harsher punishment and zero tolerance attitude towards homegrown terrorists sends a deterrence effect. It's a psychological symbol that citizens would be punished severely by virtue of you being a citizen and by virtue of you committing terrorist acts. We believe that in the cost-benefit analysis of a citizens who want or who have a tendency to commit acts of terror, they would be precluded from committing acts of terror because they fear the increased punishment that they would get. Because punishment is not a good thing; it hurts, and we it's a concession, Mr. Speaker, that this is a form of discrimination. We are discriminating between those who are local citizens, who are terrorists, and foreign terrorists. But we feel it's justified, considering that citizens have perks which foreigners don't have, Mr. Speaker. And this is what we're going to be talking about on our second point. We believe that terrorism from our citizenry poses a higher threat than those of other nationalities for a multitude of reasons. Because the perks of being a citizen are numerous. You don't have to have a visa renewal. You don't have to have checks. Trust is engendered. Your movement is not being monitored by the American government, and you're most probably not under surveillance, because there's a presumption by the state that since you're citizens, you don't pose a high level of threat as compared to you being a foreigner. There's no form of profiling if you're a citizen. We believe, Mr. Speaker, that any form of profiling would be prohibited and objected by the citizenry, because they have the power to vote and will vote out any government, or especially in Western liberal democracies, which try to breach any form of civil liberties. Just look at how in the UK, where the Gordon Brown tried to extend the remand period for terrorists under the Terrorism Act from 24 days to 48 days, it was heavily rebuked and shut down. We believe that under status quo, Mr. Speaker, citizenship is given by jus soli, right? By birth lottery, by you being born in that country. It doesn't ensure that just because you're born, you're loyal, but the state gives you that presumption nevertheless, because it respects and values the fact that you're a citizen. We believe, Mr. Speaker, that most of the time we see a tendency that terrorist cells such as Al-Qaeda are recruiting members of the citizenry for the terrorist acts, because of the fact that it's harder for them to be detected, it's harder for them it's harder for them to be caught by security services. We believe this poses a larger threat as compared to foreign terrorists, which are easily monitored and easily stamped out because they're the ones who are heavily under surveillance. We believe that a higher punishment would preclude or would force local people who wishes to join terrorist cells from doing it again, because of the fact that the punishment imposed would be higher and it would be bad for them. But secondly, thirdly, this idea of breach and loyalty and trust to the state. We believe that under status quo there are numerous civil institutions which individuals can engage with. We understand that the genesis of terrorist movements is due to the frustration of its members. You're unhappy with the system, you're unhappy with how Americans treat you, etc., and how maybe they might make a shame of your religion. However, in Western liberal democracies, and you by virtue of you being a citizen, can engage through civil institutions to voice out your concerns. You can petition your congressman, you can write up op-ed articles, and your frustrations can be addressed and heard out. As compared to foreign terrorists in countries like Pakistan, Arab Saudi, where there are little to no civil institutions to voice out their concerns, their frustrations are not likely to be heard. So their propensity to become terrorists are higher as compared to local homebred terrorists, Mr. Speaker. We contrast this to laws where local spies are punished higher for selling out our national security secrets as compared to foreign spies, because there's a degree of trust that the state confers to them as compared to foreign spies. Mr. Speaker, we need to prohibit citizens, especially us, our citizens, from becoming terrorists, and that's why we propose.
Thanks, Speaker. So we'll get to the opposition bench and call upon the leader of opposition.
We don't think that increasing propensity and wanting to deter, future acts of terrorism by our own citizens is a reasonable enough justification to increase the punishment. Because we have to examine the idea of deterrence. First of all, act of terrorism is not something that somebody wakes up one day and decides they're going to do. It's something that is fostered and it keeps festering. It's something that is created by a long-standing time of disagreement or dissatisfaction with the kind of state that is treating you, with the way that people are treating you, that you want to voice it out, you want to get back. The point is, acts of terrorism exist only when every other avenue seems to have failed. You've tried to voice it out in civic institutions. You've tried to do it through discourse, but you're constantly marginalized. Your voice is constantly drowned out by those people who wield more power, who have more money, or who just think that, or who are in the majority and therefore realize that they can drown out your concerns. But let's look at the arguments that we saw coming out from the Prime Minister. Because they had two basic ideas, right? The idea was number one, that the reason they basically wanted to do this was to increase the kind of deterrent factor. And they seem to believe that there is a psychological impact that exists on terrorists because, they now know that because they are citizens, they're going to get harsher punishments. But we believe that first of all, every act of terrorism that is conducted is, first of all, it's an act against the universal human rights. It's not an act against a state per se. It's an act on the international community. It's a crime against the international community, and that's exactly the substantive I'm going to be bringing to you in my debate today about how an act of terrorism is not bound within a state, but rather it's a global act, it's a universal act, which is why it's a breach of the universal social contract, and why everybody therefore should be given the same kind of punishment. But on the idea that, citizens, the power to vote are the government, and people still have this kind of idea, and therefore this deterrence factor, because now there's going to be a harsher punishment, is suddenly going to prevent people from wanting to go out and commit acts of terrorism. But we have to agree that that level of deterrence already exists within status quo. It's not like you can, if somebody commits an act of terrorism, they know very well that they are going to get persecuted for it on the international community. Even if their own state decides not to persecute it, other states and other actors will persecute them for it. If they think that they're going to do it and get away with it, well then in this paradigm, that kind of clause also exists. In this paradigm, even if they feel, even if they do that, even if this harsher punishment might exist, they will continue to do it because they know that they might get away with it. So the idea is the deterrence level that they want to offer, which is the sole purpose of their policy, to offer that kind of deterrence. Does it really award the deterrence that they are looking for? But on the idea of, one sec, sit down. On this idea that, they're local terrorists and they've breached this contract against the state, right? We say, well, in the United States of America, and I don't really want to be saying this, but we have to realize that there is a higher propensity amongst the black people in America to commit crimes. But that doesn't mean that we increase the punishment on black people just because we feel that there's a higher propensity for them to be committing crimes. It's not a stereotyping I'm doing here, but the kind of statistics we found that because of and this is precisely because of the kinds of people the blacks feel. And this brings me very nicely to the characterization of the kind of terrorists we're talking about in the first place. These are people who feel disenfranchised by their own community. These are people who have been let down by their state, where the policies have not been in place to protect their interests, and that's why they decide to take this route. That's why they decide to take this step of committing this act of terrorism, so as to make a public statement. You know what? We want to be heard, and this is why we think that is where it's the state's failure towards these people that has actually resulted in this sort of thing. We can't say that foreigners are subject to more scrutiny than our own citizens. If that's the case, subject your citizens to more scrutiny. But that doesn't mean you suddenly increase the punishment of terrorism on those people just because you believe that you haven't been doing a good enough job of monitoring them, or you believe that you haven't been fulfilling your duty towards them. This seems like a shoddy way of trying to take away from the fact, and it seems like the government is trying to divert the interest of the spotlight from the fact that they haven't been doing what they need to do to help these people, that they have failed in their duty towards these people, and that's why these people have been doing this. That's what side government needs to realize. Before I move on, I'll take closing.
Citizenry are expected to align themselves to national goals all the time only. Explain to us why then we can't hold them to higher standards when it comes to legality.
Because of the kind of act of terrorism that they commit in the first place. When you align yourselves to national goals, when there is a breach of that national goal, we're fine with going ahead and punishing them. We're not even saying that let these citizens go unpunished. All we're saying is, why do you have to hold them to a higher standard when it's an international act of terrorism that they've committed? It's not an act of terrorism against just a state, right? And we say courts of law exist, mitigating factors are always taken into consideration, but we don't see why suddenly this sort of act needs to be perpetrated. Moving on to the second idea, right? The idea of the social contract being universal, because we have to agree at the end of the day that the act of terrorism or the war on terrorism is a global effort. It's not an effort being undertaken by any one state towards one particular group of people. It's an act that is being undertaken, an effort that's being undertaken by the entire community of the international on the international arena, right? It's not, and these acts of terrorism are not acts against the state or the citizens or laws, but an act against humanity. It's an act saying that these people believe themselves to be completely separate from the international community, this entire international idea of humanity. They believe themselves to be above that international ideal of humanity, which is why we need to hold everybody to the same level of punishment, because that's why that's exactly where that's why we feel that it's an international act, and therefore we don't think that it gives states this idea to be able to perpetrate this kind of thing. Because you have to understand, at the end of the day, states don't own these citizens, right? They've been given them as the guardian and protector of their rights. These people have subjected themselves to the laws, and they assume that the state is going to look after them and protect their rights. Now suddenly, the state is just subjecting them to a harsher punishment, even though this act is already punished within status quo sufficiently enough. Just because they belong to a certain state doesn't mean that that state suddenly has the arbitrary duty to punish them even more. We question the deterrence that these people want to talk about, but we have to understand, at the end of the day, their policy does nothing to solve the deterrence factor. Because if I commit an act of terrorism, if I go and blow up a bomb or I go and blow up a building, I am going to be persecuted in the international court. I'm going to be subject to criticism by the international community. I don't see how much more of a harsher punishment than that I can get. For more than the sentence of death or the sentence of life imprisonment, I don't see how much more of a harsher punishment any state can impose on their own citizens, especially when those citizens are, especially when those people are victims and criminals of the international court, not any individual state court. For all these reasons, very proud of them.
Thanks, Speaker, for speech. Continue the case with the government bench and call upon the Deputy Prime Minister.
The chair is going to forward through the idea of the intensity of national trauma and fear of citizens when these acts of terrorism are committed by their own people, and why this is harmful at 3 different levels. But before that, let's pose 3 different questions to the side of opening opposition. And let's look at the first question. Are citizens who are bound by a higher degree of trust deserving of a higher punishment? 2 main things I wanted to forward. Firstly, she told us that deterrence already exists. Of course, deterrence exists with every legal system. But why is it in the early speech we can point out to the examples of the London bombing and the New York's bombing? They're existing, even with the deterrence that you say is supposedly effective. Because you think this is a failure of the legal system to create a higher risk-reward calculus within the mentality of these people. Regardless of whatever reason or whatever excuses that these individuals have to enable them to enact acts of terrorism, there needs to be a higher punishment in order to create that doubt within their mind that maybe my acts are not worth it. She simply told us that deterrence already exists, but never tell you why a higher deterrence is not justified in today's debate, or why the deterrence under status quo is sufficient to tackle within this local acts of terrorism that we tell you exists and is inherent within the status quo. But the second thing is this. She wanted to draw a parallel on blacks. You know what? We don't punish blacks even though they have more propensity to commit crimes. Well, that's obviously a false premise, because historically the blacks have a lower socioeconomic standing, they have lower education levels, and because of the historically they were racially discriminated, that's why there's a higher propensity of crime. That's massively different, because you're not talking about all blacks, you're talking about a segment of blacks. But everyone with our nationality is similar. Everyone who is a US citizen has a common value of the trust and loyalty and that contract that you draw within the state. She didn't report any of the analysis that Ari told you on why this justification does not stand, because we told you why. Because of that greater degree of trust, these citizens have a greater ease of access of everything. They have greater freedom of movement. They have that benefit of the doubt that they can establish with state authorities. They have that greater ease to commit that act of terrorism, taking advantage of the kind of trust that the state confers to you because you're a citizen. Because of this significant level of degree of trust and how much easiness we benefit and rights we confer to you. This is why when you take advantage of the trust, we see you are deemed for higher punishment because you betray us and you betray the state. That analysis still stands. But let's look at the second question pose to them are acts of terrorism justified? Because when you listen to the LO speech, it almost seems like she believes that it's okay when you're feeling resentment against the state and the state doesn't want to hear you, that you act out in its physical manner and destroy things and bomb civilians. Even if this feelings of resentment has festered and somehow the state has failed them. Nowhere did she tell you under state imperatives in Western liberal democracies why you still cannot access these state avenues and discourse, even if the state has failed to hear them. Why is it that these avenues of democracy that we pointed out to you is inefficient to still effectively engage with them? We say even if they haven't been listened to, there should be no justification for you to act out against the law, physically hurt people and kill lives just because your ideas of what is right is not being heard. We will provide you the avenues and tools for you to efficiently address the state. And if those tools exist, there's no reason for side of opening opposition to say the state has failed them, A, or B, that there is no propensity of continuance for them to continue to be heard, or C, that there is a justification for them to lash out against your other citizens simply because your feelings were not heard adequately by the state. That's never something that you should support. The third question is this: is terrorism an international concern in today's debate? Now, this is where they were very idealistic. Of course, it's an international issue. We can see if international organizations want to take extra actions, that's okay. That's a different debate. But firstly, show us the efficacy and the greatness of that deterrence that are imposed by international organizations. Because if you look at trends and precedents and the status quo, very little international cases are taken against individuals. They're mostly taken up against states that act out in acts of aggression against other states. We don't see war criminals or other individuals who are engaged in acts of terrorism actually being caught, actually being prosecuted, or creating the artificial level of deterrence that you say exists. But secondly, why is not the debate? Eric told you this is about intra-boundaries terrorism. So if you want that terrorism to be taken to an international level, fine. But this is when the state can't even ensure national security, and that threat of security is being perpetuated by your own people. Why is it wrong for that state to take that prerogative upon themselves to secure their own people within their own boundaries? That's the debate in today's. That's the debate and contention within today's speeches. I don't know why she's talking about international issues. Before I board my substantive, yes, opening.
Could you really think that if with whatever higher punishment that you have in mind, please tell us what that is, how you could have prevented the New York bombings or the London bombings?
Exactly, like had any other law works, if suddenly instead of life imprisonment you get the death penalty, I'm sure you think twice before committing that act of terrorism, because once you're caught, there's no more future for you. Deterrence is already sufficiently explained within every speech. I don't know why she's wasting my time by asking the same question. Again, let's look at this idea of intensity of national trauma and fear of citizens. Firstly, here's the difference when you want to talk about, let's say, the 9/11 attack. Because within the trauma that is perpetuated across the nation when a terrorist attack occurs is massive. Even though a few thousands died, 40 million across the nation now fear for their lives. But within those instances, the society's defense mechanism is always finding that person to be blamed, making that public enemy, make it Taliban, make it Afghanistan, whatever it is, let's unite against them, and you create a cathartic effect of social healing and retribution. But what happens when that public enemy is a person that's like you and me? There's no distinction. He or she is a US citizen. Their lives can't be distinguished. They're just mere individuals. Now you don't have that avenue of blame. What you create instead is a rampage of fear that any one of us can be terrorists who are attacking our own people. And this is the new perspective that artificially creates that climate of fear. But secondly, we believe that's an unfair psychological burden for you to push onto society. Why? Because we believe the state always operates on a tangent to safeguard the society, because law always acts to create that element of security, because that is essential to the operations of society, which is why you can't yell fire in a crowded theater, which is why you can't carry a baseball bat publicly on the side of the street, because you can't have member society fearing of what you might do with those tools, right? It's the government's duty to create that atmosphere of security regardless, which is why in 9/11 you had the nationalism campaign to unite against the Taliban, to create a cathartic effect against the trauma. But thirdly, how does our proposal mitigate this harm? We believe the harm is that corrosion of trust to your fellow members of society, right? Similarly to how the state cultivates that trust by executing exemplary punishments against rapists and pedophiles. And this punishment is not proportional to your act of crime, but you give you a higher punishment because A, society needed a retribution, and B, society needed to feel safe. So we believe a harsher punishment would be able to gain that trust within that members of society. That state is fulfilling their duty to create that atmosphere of security and to regain the trust within fellow members, within citizens. And this is how we can amend and mitigate this the national trauma and fear that you create within our own people. Mr. Speaker, this debate is about intra-boundaries terrorism. When you trust your people too much and you confer rights to your people and you take
by antagonizing your own people and taking advantage of your trust and hurting in acts of terrorism. Avenues exist for them to further continue, and that's the debate that our opposition should engage with.
Here.
Thanks, Speaker, for a speech. Continue the case of the opposition bench. I call upon the Deputy Leader of Opposition.
Here. Mr. Speaker, opening government gets fourth in this debate, and I'm not ashamed to claim that. Why? Because the only case that they premise on is that by punishing people harsher, they will not do it. That means that the effect of deterrence must be the primary cause and the primary effect that they must show in this debate. I'm afraid that they haven't shown it from Prime Minister's speech down to my speech, right? Why? And I'm going to do this by responding to the entire case on 3 levels. Firstly, we will not be ashamed to say that this is a problem-solution mismatch. In fact, we think there is no effect in the end. Why? Because firstly, we tell you that if you implement this, right, it doesn't deal with the idea of prevention. We think that the most effective way to deal with these kinds of terrorism acts is through the idea of prevention. Something like closing government, causing opposition feel. Why? And we think that's right? Because if you really want to deal with the root of the problem, which means homegrown terrorism, then your intelligence officers must be doing a much better job. This doesn't mean that it's not mutually exclusive. The problem is that you divert the kind of resources and psychological capital that people have. That means that now people feel a falser way of feeling safe, right? That means that people in the country feel that, well, if my own citizens commit a crime against me, that means the problem, the solution is that, well, my government is going to punish these people even harsher. That creates a kind of false safety that people feel, which also means that it removes the kind of responsibility that governments then should do and look into these things harsher. That means then that when homegrown terrorism does happen, it creates a much larger backlash from the ground, on the ground itself. Firstly, we tell you that there's a problem-solution mismatch in that aspect, right? That you're not really dealing with the problem, you're just waiting for things to happen and then punish people harsher because they betrayed you, while you didn't betray your citizens by not putting in much more effort into looking into the situation itself. Second response to that case, and this is where bulk of the analysis comes from, that deterrence works. And this is where every said, which might try to distance himself and say that, well, I will explain to you. He said that, well, fear from a harsher punishment will make people not do it. That was the only analysis that came out from opening government. Right? We're going to break that down onto a few levels. Right? Firstly, we tell you that deterrence never works when the goal is high, when people are set according to what they want to achieve. We think ideological empowerment and financial incentives are very powerful tools to break the chains of deterrence itself. I'll give you a few examples. If you look at cases like China, where a hell lot of people are being executed every day, or you look at cases like Iran, where people are being executed due to political differences, you see that a lot of people still go out and do it. You see a lot of drug trafficking happening, trickling down from China down to the Golden Triangle, because people see a powerful monetary tool to escape the chains of poverty. Even the drug trafficking gives you the death penalty, Mr. Speaker. You see people trying to break the chains of the Ayatollahs, even though that gives them a death penalty, Mr. Speaker. We told you in Manda's characterization of these people, these homegrown terrorists. They're not people who decide to do it on the day itself. These people build up that kind of resentment over the decades and feel that they're being unjustly treated by the state and no longer identify themselves with the people on the ground itself. That's why they're highly motivated to do it. They don't see the claims of the legal perspectives of the state. That means if you do this is a consequence as something that they accept and as something that they see abiding themselves to. In fact, if they could, they want to destroy the state. That's why a lot of the people that bomb, like attempted to do the bombings, for example, in New York Times Square bombers, right, do not accept the legitimacy of the American government because they think that the American government has betrayed them in many ways. So the idea of deterrence on their side never ever works, and that's something that closing government's burden automatically falls upon their shoulders. Right? So we tell you, examine the context of this situation. Deterrence is a poor and tool in order to combat the kind of homegrown terrorism that they wanted to. Right? We don't think that's what we should be doing. Right? Now, third response to their side, take a seat. Right? This idea about people will feel more insecure if your local citizens do it as compared to foreign citizens. We think that's firstly a false claim. Right? For example, when the Mumbai attacks happened, a lot of people felt insecure
insecure, not because Indian citizens do it, Iskandar, but because the Pakistani people came in and infiltrated their country. People felt insecure anyway, right? It's not as a high degree of insecurity. When a bomb goes off in your country, Mr. Speaker, you are going to feel insecure in the first place. But secondly, even if people do somehow feel more insecure, right? We tell you that this impression that you're creating doesn't do justice, right? Because I want to make a point that the bombers who did in, for example, in the London bombing, or for example in New York Times Square, were all people of, well, Muslims who are of immigrant descent, right? So you automatically create that kind of psychological impression that these people are much more responsible for anything out there. And because the state sanctions that, the state says that, well, these people, unfortunately, who are of that particular category, right, should receive a harsher punishment. People on the ground then feel that these people, collectively as a race, whether you're innocent or not, should be more responsible to that act, which creates a larger discrimination and a larger backlash onto these people. I'm waiting for closing government, by the way. You guys didn't take a BOI, take a seat. Yes.
At the end of the day, these citizens are still principally held to higher standards. Explain to us principally why then we can't hold them to the same standards.
So this is closing government section. I'm sure many very nicely comes to my substantive. Right? I want to talk to you about three things in my speech very quickly. Firstly, this concept of justice itself. Why we think justice should be blind and taken from an original position. Secondly, I'm going to talk to you about this magnification of duties, clashing specifically with closing government. Why we think that magnification is okay, positive duties, but not a negative duty, something that they want to punish. Okay, let's talk about the first concept. This idea about the idea of justice itself. We think that crime at the most essential level must be commensurated to the act itself. That means that whatever punishment you do must be commensurated proportionately. The basis of passing these judgments, of passing these laws, isn't based on the color of passport, Mr. Speaker, because we need to accept, coming from opening government, that the idea of punishment and crime and justice is being delegated to states. But at the end of the day, all these people deserve the same kind of basic human rights. This idea of cosmopolitanism that Manda talked to you about, right? The states then are being assigned those kinds of duties to protect these own citizens, not to punish, but then do not really hold or own these people at the same time. That means at the end of the day, if you have a law, right, that is based on a blanket idea of punishing a particular group of people, regardless of the situations, then we think that's unfair and that's not unjustified in terms of justice itself. Because you need to look at how you should punish these people based on the crimes itself and include mitigation factors. We're fine with that. But the moment you say that automatically a particular group of people should get punished larger, we don't think that under the idea of law and justice itself that's fine, right? But secondly, we want to go on to the more important idea in this debate, this idea about duties and where does it really lie. We think when you weigh the scales of positive versus negative duties, right? We think citizens always have a higher positive duties than foreigners. That's where they're confusing the entire idea. For example, we think citizens must pay taxes in their own country, but foreigners don't have to pay taxes. We think citizens should be or can be conscripted, but foreigners don't have that duties. Because those are positive duties, Mr. Speaker, that bring the country forward, that protects the country, that elevates the status and the quality of the country itself. But let's compare this to the idea that they're trying to propound now, the idea about negative duties. We think negative duties often have a common universal standard and a threshold at the bottom itself. These thresholds should not be changed. For example, that it's not like a local citizen should not kill a local citizen, but it's kind of okay if a foreigner kills a local citizen. Now, we tell you that the negative duty at the very lowest level should be universal regardless of the color of the passport. They are trying to confuse those two things. We're perfectly fine with positive duties being magnified, but we're not fine with negative duty having a larger burden on the local citizens as compared to foreigners itself. The idea that we're saying that deterrence works and it should be a cause doesn't show. We hope closing government does a better job.
The first half of today's debate. So in the second half, we'll call upon the member of government.
Mr. Speaker, I think it's safe to say that all houses today agree that we need to mitigate the threat of terror within our country. And ultimately, the goal of this would be to further the global war on terror so that we can reach a stage where we are free from this threat to our nation. what side closing government is going to bring to you is exactly how this policy forces governments to stake a claim of ownership over terrorism, which helps us fight terrorism better, and that is what our extension today is going to be about. But before that, some rebuttals to what came up from side opposition. Firstly, they came up to us and argued with us on this idea of deterrence and how exactly it is not a good enough reason for us to increase the punishment and how it's not going to do any good. First of all, Mr. Speaker, as side opening has already said, deterrence is only a positive consequence of increasing the punishment. The purpose of increasing the punishment is because we abhor this idea of a citizen attacking his own fellow citizens, his fellow nationals. I think it is this abhorrence of this idea which warrants this increase of punishment, because we always hold our citizens to a greater degree of expectations in terms of their duty towards their own country, Mr. Speaker. We always hold citizens to a greater degree of loyalty. We expect our citizens to serve the country with a certain degree of dedication so that they are not found committing crimes against the very fabric of their own country, Mr. Speaker. Ultimately, a person always feels more betrayed when a fellow brother does something to hurt that person, Mr. Speaker. But if a foreigner does that, yes, of course, they are going to be still angered, but the amount of hurt felt is always going to be greater when a fellow citizen actually causes that harm. Secondly, Mr. Speaker, we think that this positive consequences, one that is going to be effective in the long run to actually bring about this change in the decrees of terror, and this is something which I will be elaborating later on in my substantive as well. And then they brought in their substantive in DLO speech, they brought up this idea of justice and how it should only punish the crime and not so much the nationality of the crime. But we see, Mr. Speaker, that majority of crimes which are being committed in the recent past, majority of terrorism-related crimes are being committed by people of the same nationality, given the examples that opposition already brought to you about. So we think that even if we were to agree with them on this principle that it has to be only about the crime, that we have to target the majority of the crimes which are being committed in this framework by people of that very same citizenry. And we think that is a good enough reason for us to increase this punishment. And secondly, on this idea that they brought about that of a positive versus a negative duty, and they said that how it is okay for us to magnify a positive duty, but it's not okay for us to magnify a negative duty, because a negative duty is equal for both citizens and foreigners. First of all, Mr. Speaker, a magnification of any duty for a citizen is always done in the interest of society. It is not done whether it is positive. It is not done on a basis whether it's positive or negative. Ultimately, if that magnification of that duty can benefit society, ladies and gentlemen, we think that it is a good enough reason for the state to magnify that duty. If we think that a higher fine for any crime created is going to help and benefit society, we think it is a good thing, Mr. Speaker. If there's a higher punishment for any other crime as well, Mr. Speaker, we think ultimately it is going to benefit society and it deserves to be done, Mr. Dam. Let me now move on to my substantive, Mr. Speaker, and I'll be explaining to you this idea of the ownership of terrorism. And before that, yes, sir.
Ma'am, we told you already that if a foreigner as a local citizen kills someone, rapes someone, and so forth, gets the same punishment. Why is there an exemption for this particular case?
Because over here, this idea of a rape or anything is not something which is as deeply connected to the idea of national security, Mr. Speaker. Over here, we're talking about the fabric of the nation, about the security and the safety of the nation as a whole, as a collective unit, Mr. Speaker. And when you have, as someone who is on the inside, inflicting that amount of damage, we think it always does hurt more. I think I've spent enough time on that, Siddharth. Let me now move on to my substantive, right? Now we see, Mr. Speaker, what is happening in the status quo, right? Let's bring this debate back to reality. We see that today, terrorists are always being labeled as non-state actors so that the country dissociates themselves from this terrorism because they don't want to be tainted with this idea of terrorism. We see this happen with the idea of Pakistan dissociating itself with Ajmal Kasab. We saw this with the example of USA dissociating itself from David Headley. And we see that this, Mr. Speaker, is the biggest roadblock in the war of terror because this initiates a blame game, Mr. Speaker. We see that this blame game is where countries are now blaming other parties, parties like the Al-Qaeda or foreign influences for swaying their citizens away. And what happens because of this, Mr. Speaker? This leads to limited efforts being put in to actually weed out homegrown terrorism, and that is today's problem, Mr. Speaker. Sit down. We see that when a state denies that their own country is breeding terror by not paying much attention to this breeding of homegrown terror, is not doing enough to actually weed out this terror. We think that the state, see that the state is actually ignoring their duty towards actually putting in a strong enough effort to go out and do something for the terror which is breeding within their country. We see this in the case of Pakistan as well. Even though Pakistan has aligned itself with on USA's side to actually go to fight terror, they're not doing much because they keep denying the fact that terrorism is homegrown in their country, Mr. Speaker, and that is what is leading to so many problems today. Sit down. We think that our policy forces this country and the state to take ownership of homegrown terror, and by creating a harsher punishment, they are recognizing the fact that homegrown terror is a big problem and it is one of the main forms of terror plaguing their country today. Sit down. We think this then forces the government to evaluate their own citizenry, creating critical discourse. It forces them to see the sentiments of their citizenry. Sit down. It forces them to see the frustration. It forces them to invest more resources in actually battling homegrown terror and weeding out homegrown terror. And why exactly does this happen, Mr. Speaker? This happens because of dual accountability. Let me explain this. We think that when a harsher punishment is imposed, it deters the citizens, as has already been proven today, because it makes the citizens more accountable for their actions. However, this imposition of this greater burden on the citizen forces the citizens to expect the same amount of dedication to this cause on the part of the government. It forces the citizens to hold the government to the same standards of dedication of a proper behavior in terms of dealing with this problem of terror. It forces the Senate, it creates a mutual check and balance where the citizens have to be in place and in line in terms of the treatment of terror, and it forces the government as well to make sure that they are doing enough, Mr. Speaker, to tackle the problem of homegrown terror. And then let's finally see how this exactly helps the global war against terror. Because we see that there's now a pluralistic effect when every country is taking homegrown terror very, very seriously. When we have countries like Pakistan as well as the US, as well as Afghanistan and Yemen taking homegrown terror seriously, we think that it then negates this war, it then negates global terror by effect of pluralism, and we think that eventually our policy is the one which does far more good than their paradigm. For all these reasons, the NTU takes this case.
Thanks, Speaker, for the speech. Call upon the member of opposition to take the case to the opposition bench.
The first faulty assumption coming from the OG is that the United States is a very homogeneous country, that everyone is getting along together very well, that everyone is trusting the same government in the very same way. We don't think that is the case. We believe that the United States and all the liberal democracy, for example the UK, is also consisted of all the diversities of ethnicity or even religious sectors that are not trusting the government in the very same way. For example, in the US, where the white is the majority, where Muslim is the minority, and Muslim in the States, there's always threatened to be the risk and always deemed to be the threat of that particular society just because there is Al-Qaeda, just because there is 9/11. We don't think that characterization is actually a good thing. But the policy that OG has brought up is actually to undermine the trust that those minorities group will actually have back towards the own government itself. That they preemptively say that these particular minorities are more likely or even equally likely to be the same as the Al-Qaeda, as the Taliban that is abroad. That you're not trusting their nationalities, you're not trusting the citizen on the ground to do them. If you are saying that you would like to strengthen and put more scrutiny on these kind of terrorists on the ground, you can do so at whatever cost, but not to preemptively convict them to be the victims, to convict them to be the bad guys. Because the moment that you do that, it incentivizes them to distrust you more and to actually rise up more and retaliate against you. But on the point of the closing government, right, they were talking about another thing. They're still prolonged on this idea of deterrence. But I will tell you why deterrence do not work in this particular case on two levels. On the first level, those people who are willing to commit this kind of terrorist to begin with, they actually have long line or long history of their own ideology that they want to push forward. Thus, this kind of deterrence don't really actually deter them to begin with, because they deem that those kind of needs, those kind of ideology is actually so centralized to who they are, to their survival, or even to their own identity, that it's worth it that they would like to make this kind of thing. But on a second point, which will also be on my point of extension, this will actually incentivize these kind of people with real tangible needs to actually resort to those terrorist groups out overseas, and that is going to escalate the intensity and even escalate the network groups of people deeming to overthrow the government of that particular state. But now, so what the closing opposition was saying is that we need this kind of legislation to preemptively say that preemptively put more scrutiny on our own land, right? There is no logical link coming from them whatsoever. That why is it that we would then will then not put any kind of scrutiny or even CIA within our own grounds, knowing that our own country is diversified, knowing that those kind of Al Qaeda is being infiltrated in our own countries as well. That is a very lack of analysis coming from them. In my own extension, I will talk about two things. I'll talk about firstly and briefly why the rule of law does not punish you just from just by the identity of who you are. Secondly, but the most important one is how their acts of policy will actually escalate the severity of terrorism acts in the future, and also how it will enhance the proliferation of terrorist network as a whole. Yes.
Don't you think, madam, that surveillance on your own people will increase the tension with minorities who are being surveyed and profiled under your paradigm as well? And you never prove how surveillance will work.
Of course, under your own case, you already talked in your OG speech, right? That whatever means that the government is trying to impose on your own citizens will not go into the extent that it makes them uncomfortable. But also, it must not preemptively put some sort of distrust that it will say that you are not trusted by the government and you have those certain rights taken away from you. But now, on the closing opposition, we would like to say that if you have such ideology that is so centralized to yourself that you're willing to risk the threat of you being abided by the law and being punished, you actually have some sort of needs that needs to be voiced out. The last resort that you can do while saving the two things that is so important to you: first, your lives, not to be caught in whatever policy or implementation that they would like to put and still push their voices forward, is actually to resort to the people out overseas, right? Because those people actually already have the capacities to strike whatever is on the United States without actually having the interest to actually protect any kind of damage or do any kind of damage control within its own country. Because once it's done on the domestic land, those people have the intention to actually voice out their own needs for their own survival and still be subjected to those kind of law. But those people overseas, they don't have any kind of incentive to hold back, because their intention is to overthrow those government to begin with. We believe that once you actually incentivize this kind of terrorist group when it's homegrown to go overseas, it means that it actually proliferate and actually expand the network of terrorism overseas and actually expel your own problems on the sea over ground. Because why? We see that the United States and all the head of states of these big countries are actually already targets of people in countries like all the rogue states, North Korea, whatever states, for example. Even though they don't have the same agenda, even though they are not in this for the same reason, their only ultimate goal is the same: that they want to overthrow this kind of stability. They would like to instabilize the kind of stability that the United States have. Thus, once there is any kind of incentive to actually have these people within the domestic land resort and contract its needs through other networks that is already existing, it means that the severity of the terrorist action in the future will be more likely than not to escalate, because these people overseas, they're already equipped with whatever is needed to strike into these countries. But on the last point, on the rule of law, right? We believe that you are the government only needs to punish for whatever commitment to those actions that you're doing. If you are convicting someone from the from who you are, from the identity, or even who you were born with, you're more likely than not to segregate the population within your own countries, and thus those minority within your own countries will more likely to actually racially connect or religiously connect to the citizen of the people overseas. Now the Muslim within the United States will more likely than not to be connected to the Muslim out overseas than to actually hold the best interest of the U.S. at heart. In order to centralize such a diverse society within the United States, we actually have to target these people to begin with. The policy coming from the opening government and connected through the closing is actually something that is undermining this trust. It actually segregates the society into many pieces and actually incentivize these many pieces to actually resort to even more severe terrorist groups. Thank you.
Thanks, Speaker, for a speech. And the final speech from the government bench. I call upon the government whip.
Let's be clear, Mr. Speaker. Today's side closing opposition never dealt with our extension about how taking ownership of local terrorist networks and facing that kind of disproportionate punishment then therefore creates that sense of pluralistic networks of governments working inwards and looking inwards to push for that kind of justice to improve the fight against terror, Mr. Speaker. They never showed us why then that kind of dual accountability, when the government is then validated for placing that kind of additional obligation on their citizenry, is something that pushes them to reevaluate the fight for anti-terrorist movements. At the end of the day, Mr. Speaker, let's look at this debate on three big ideas. Firstly, the idea of deterrence. Secondly, the idea of justice and the duties that we hold to the government. And lastly, this idea that really are we incentivizing them to go overseas and who fights the fight against terror in a much better way. So quickly then, Mr. Speaker, the idea of deterrence. Because all OO came up and told you today was that, look, at the end of the day, acts of terrorism only exist because of long-term resentment, that these kind of things can't be changed overnight. First response to that, Mr. Speaker, here we're not here to listen about sob stories of terrorists and the motivation behind why they do things. Deterrence at the end of the day, Mr. Speaker, is given that they are doing all of these things, which kind of punishment then prevents and negates these kind of things in a much better way. Given that framework, Mr. Speaker, we think then the acts that have already been committed, we think then that what pushes them or what proves to be a better deterrent, Mr. Speaker, is as many deterrents we can have and which the government can provide to punish these people as much as possible. You can have other deterrents like what you showed, Mr. Speaker, but at the end of the day, they never proved why an additional deterrent is not good enough. On the second level then, they came up and told us that look, they'll still be persecuted on an international arena anyway. Why is this increased deterrence? We think it's not, this is the nuance they missed, right? It's not about whether you're going to be punished or not, but it's about the degree, Mr. Speaker, the speed and the impact of the punishment that is being meted out to you in a consolidated, concerted manner. At the end of the day, the decision-making calculus of the terrorist changes when you know that the obligations placed on local terrorism is far much more disproportionate in the way the legal system is looking at you. We think then that the degree and the impact of that punishment is what really proves to be the greater deterrent in this case. Sit down. But on a more important level, and this is what they came up and told us, right? They came up and said that look, this is a preemptive measure, something that came up in Tokyo. They said that look, because it's a preemptive measure, it won't prove to be good enough, and that now these terrorists will resent the government and hate them, and so they will become terrorists as well. We think first of all, this is a shaft from OO, who said that look, these terrorists turn to terrorism because of long-term resentment. We don't think then that this kind of policy will immediately shift normal citizens into bigger terrorists. But more importantly, we think this is not a preemptive measure, it's a preemptive message. But at the end of the day, the punishment, Mr. Speaker, is still a punishment based on tangible crime that is committed. But more importantly, we think what incentivizes them to go overseas, Mr. Speaker? We think international terrorism is always starts with a localized scope of terrorism to begin with. We think if you first and foremost stop localized crime and localized terrorism, then we think international crime and international terrorism is weeded out immediately as well. And this they completely failed to see Madras analysis on the pluralistic approach to fighting terrorism to begin with. If every country is going to prevent localized terrorism, Mr. Speaker, then international terrorism and crime flourishing has a much lesser likelihood from happening. But at the end of the day, this is what they said, right? They said that, look, at the end of the, that because this is an international crime, Mr. Speaker, it needs an international punishment. We have a few problems with that because we don't think that the motivation of every terrorist attack is necessarily international in scope or international in its approach, Mr. Speaker. This is an assertion, have a seat, that assertion that the terrorism is inherently an international crime. We think a lot of terrorist attacks are highly localized in scopes, are highly targeted to fight against a particular community within particular national frameworks. We don't agree then that terrorism is necessarily always an international crime. But more importantly, we believe that because these terrorists are citizens, Mr. Speaker, they never tackled with why then principally because they are held to higher standards as citizens, why then principally we can't be holding them to higher standards as well. But before I move on, I'll take closing.
Don't you think that tackling the network within your own land is much more easier than you tackling the network that is already joined hands within the people?
Exactly, Madam Speaker, exactly, because it's much better for us to have a more localized scope of dealing with terrorist networks, that we should first and foremost push that kind of accountability on local governments to increase justice and to push them to fight local networks as well. Precisely because we think international terrorism starts with local state actors, we think then that local citizens should be first held to a higher standard. Sit down. But at the end of the day, Mr. Speaker, we think, and this is where I move on to my second idea of duties and justice. Mr. Speaker, they come up and tell us, especially in opening, right, side speech, he said that, look, positive duties in terms of tax and some tax, etc., are something we hold citizens to because it furthers social progress, but we don't do the same thing for negative duties, Mr. Speaker. We have a problem with that because we think duties and obligations that a state places on its citizens are always based on the perception and concept of societal progress. So whatever best promotes societal progress is then what the basic and the premise of these social expectations to begin with. At the end of the day, the ultimate goal of a government is to push for societal progress, Mr. Speaker. If at the end of the day, this kind of disproportionate punishment is pushing these people to become, for example, to promote national goals, then we're very happy to stand by these negative duties as well. But most importantly, and this is where closing clashes with CO, right? Because they came up and told us, look, disproportionate punishment is not fair. We tell you that disproportionate punishment is not invalid justice, Mr. Speaker. We do this on a domestic level every time. When we give disproportionate punishment to bring about greater justice or greater closure or greater, for example, deterrence for a number of crimes. We think, for example, when males are held to different standards for different crimes, for example, there's never been a precedent where disproportionate punishment is considered invalid justice. If anything at all, if it promotes societal progress and brings about greater justice, we think disproportionate justice is justice enough. At the end of the day, Mr. Speaker, we need to realize that insecurity and fear in an atmosphere of terrorism is fundamentally based on the psyche that my citizen is cheating on me, is creating that breach of social trust. At the end of the day, it's the idea of an internal threat versus an external attack. What you do, Mr. Speaker, when you push your citizens to that higher level of accountability is to recognize that my citizens are held to a higher principled standard, where because they're enjoying these kind of benefits we're giving them, that kind of accountability that the state validates on you, then pushes these governments to, Mr. Speaker, put in that greater effort and extension we brought to you. At the end of the day, Mr. Speaker, this debate is about who pushes for anti-terrorist networks in a much better way. We think because the government now has that dual accountability, we think we do a far better job. We think then that NTA takes this case.
Thanks, speaker, for a speech. And for the final speech of today's debate, I call upon the opposition.
Mr. Speaker, both sides agree on one thing, that we should deter the terrorist attacks. The missing link coming from the side of the government is this. They basically focus only on the domestic attacks that come from these terrorists. They basically try to shift the whole attention from the overseas attacks, which came from the extension is going to be even worse. We uphold the idea of the attacks can actually come from the both sides and both sources, in which we think that you should not weigh out and should leave a loophole into which attention you should actually pay attention more. Which we think that links back to the motion on the idea that how we exploit on the harsher punishment means that you give more attention to even one side. So now let's respond a little bit first to the side of the closing opposition of government just now. They basically say they're in their extension that you are trying to shift the attentions to counter the terrorists overseas and not paying attentions to the domestically grown network. The first response, we think that the idea of the domestic terrorists are already easily detected in the first place. This is the idea, the concept that came from the OG in the first place. We don't really think that how we're going to shift the attention in the end. But the second response and how our policy does is we provide equal punishment, we provide equal attention. We're not really shifting from one terrorist source into another terrorist source. We don't really see how we're going to neglect one or another. But the third response is this. What exactly does your policy do? You're basically trying to pay less attention to the overseas networks and allows a loophole for these terrorist groups within your own land, which you outsource to the overseas, which is the extension that we talked about, which we think is much more dangerous because now, according to the OG, is much harder to actually detect. It's really much harder to actually take control of. So basically, what I'm going to talk about in my speech, I'm going to talk about how exactly do we deter the future terrorist attacks as much as possible. Let's have a look again, step back a little bit, what the status quo that the opening government talked about. The idea that she said, well, the status quo doesn't work, there's still bombings in London, there's still bombing in New York. We think the first thing, we told you, even in our POI, that how the terrorists actually don't care at all about the punishment. We think that they don't care about the punishment. They try to argue on the grounds of the level of the punishment that these terrorists might care. We think that it's not really the level of punishment that's the problem, but the idea that even if there's punishment, we don't really think that in their minds they're going to care whether they will be caught or not. We think that some are even willing to die in order to fight for their ideology, like suicide bombers, for example. We don't really see that how any kind of punishment is going to work in that case. So how exactly do we deal with the case of how these terrorists do not care at all? We think that what exactly does the policy does is the case that how you're sending a message, you're trying to solve the problem at the end of the end of the problem. You're trying to send a message that the government will never ever try to engage with the characterization of the terrorists, how they resent from the government and how they act and how they voice out on their own. But the government will say, whatever you say, I'm going to try to increase the punishment of your own actions. I will neglect your voice. I will neglect your concerns. We think that it's going to be even worse. We think that it's going to be even worse, even worse under your case. So we think that the government does not care at all why the people are actually upset, but once they're upset and they act out, they're going to punish them. Basically, you're creating this vicious circle of the terrorists not listen and not care about the punishment, and the government engaging with them by only try to punish them. We don't really think that you can actually deter any future attacks that comes in this case. But now let's discuss the second premise of this debate. How do we actually best deter the idea of future attacks? This is what comes in the extension that we try to talk about. We think that in this case, you're trying to allow the loophole of these people to exploit, not by changing the strategy of how they want to attack against the government. You're basically not stopping them from doing so because we don't think that they will in any way stop at all, right? We told you that they try to exploit this loophole by using this strategic way to actually outsource the people, which is going to be even worse attacks in this case. One, what did we tell you from the extension? You were going to spill over your domestic mess into the international terrorist networks, which is going to be even much harder for you to actually detect, much harder for you to actually deal with. We think basically now it's not only the minority groups in the US who are against you, but now it's all the Muslim minority groups in the US linked with Al-Qaeda, linked with all the other international terrorist groups that are now against you. But now you can't even see or foresee how exactly they're going to attack against you, because it's not now your civilian who are going to attack within your own land. But now it's going to be in the force that what happened in 911, they send the plane to crash not on your own land. How
how it's being conducted on a fake news in this case, which we think is going to be worse. You can't foresee, and you can actually detect this kind of problem to begin with. So basically, what we try to say in our extension, we try to actually assist them or assist these terrorists to actually try to find each other, try to help each other to go against you, which we don't think it will be a good way to deter the terrorists. In this case, it's closing.
At the end of the day, deal with this idea that the government has to validate this additional obligation on its citizens, and therefore is pushed to take greater ownership against the fight with terror, the concept of dual accountability. Tell us then how, under your paradigm, you encourage the very same thing.
Yeah, this is exactly the third point I want to talk about in this debate, right? So the third point, the idea when we talk about the citizen and the law and the national security, let's deal with it. So firstly, we think that let's deal with the premise that came from the opening government first. They basically say, oh, these citizens actually have a higher chance, or they have a higher chance on attacking the government, and therefore they deserve harsher punishment. We told you, the opening opposition told you this does not make sense. We don't think that anyone will actually take that into consideration. It doesn't make sense principally. But what we also told you furthermore from the closing opposition is the idea that how the terrorists, regardless of their race, regardless of skin color, they don't care about the punishment. They don't care about the level of punishment at all. The second thing that we tell you, how the standards of laws actually extends to the universal level. It does not lock in only the idea of your identity or on only the idea of your nation or your citizen. Simply because these crimes happen at the same level. Basically, these terrorists are also human beings, are equal human beings. They commit exactly the same crime, but why do they deserve? Why do they deserve different punishment? It's exactly the same crime. Let me talk about the same crimes. How is this wrong universally? How it is wrong being the standard of the society, right? So first of all, we also tell you how this you're going to further disconnect the minority groups in that country to further find their ethnicities or their races within other countries, and that is going to be worse because now they will have even more supporters. Like you have the person like in Iraq trying to go against yourself, or you have the Taliban in Pakistan and Afghanistan connect by their race but not connect by the nation that they belong to, which we think is going to be worse because they won't like you and they will hate you even more.
I thank the speaker for her speech. I thank all speakers for their speeches. I invite them to cross the floor and shake hands. The result will be announced after this in the other room. So pack up your stuff. You can everyone else leave the room while we come to this event. I'll give everyone 3 minutes to do this.